You know, just over a year ago, I thought that pretty much every single hole in Falcom's release lineup that would reasonably ever get filled had been. But the publishers over at Refint Games have proved me wrong with the brand new release of Ys vs Trails in the Sky Alternative Saga. In fact, they've not only proved me wrong, but they've also really gone above and beyond to refine and polish this little small scope PSP game to a level that is, quite frankly, is probably more than it deserves. Now, I already covered the game back in the day with a more general review when the old Geofront fan translation dropped, so if that's what you want, I'll leave a link in the description and pinned comment. But a basic rundown of the game, however, is that it's a cute and simple 4-player arena fighter like Power Stone 2, but one with a big single-player element and RPG mechanics like Final Fantasy Distia, which, funnily enough, were both games that you could play on the PSP back in the day. But for this video, I want to shine a light on this brand new port specifically, because one, I think the publisher and developers of this version really deserve the recognition, and two, there's actually quite a lot to talk about with this new remaster, and how it does a damn good job of outshining what's already available using an emulator. First up, I'll start with the obvious basic technical improvements, since they're the easiest to notice. Resolution is nice and high, you can likely run it on just about whatever you want. It is a PSP game after all, so you could probably get it up to 4K on even a basic 10-year-old laptop. Now that would be overkill and you'd likely run into some problems if you did that, but the point is that even if you're running on a potato, you'll be able to use whatever resolution you want and max out the monitor or TV that you're using. As for the consoles, while I haven't personally tested them, looking online it seems to be that the PS4 and Switch versions run at 1080p and the PS5 version runs at 4K. Either way, it's still way more than you'd ever need for a PSP game like this, being 16 to 64 times the original resolution. A notable thing, however, is support for weird arbitrary aspect ratios, so if you're rocking an ultra-wide monitor or a Steam Deck, you can still take full advantage of the screen available. There's also the ability to select up to 16 times anisotropic filtering, so textures can look good even at wide angles, which is a must for any modern port since the performance impact is practically non-existent for such a sizable boon. And finally, there's options for 2, 4, and 8 times multi-sample anti-aliasing, or MSAA, which, like resolution, is kind of overkill for a PSP game, but it's nice that it's there. Something to mention, however, is if you are somehow getting performance problems, this is likely the setting you want to tone down, with FXAA being available for if you're really struggling. The biggest core change, however, is something that could only really be done via a port like this, and that is the boost to 60 frames per second, which, considering this is technically a fighting game, was very much needed. When I played the original, I always kind of felt like, yeah, 60 would have been nice, but considering how this is a pretty simplistic arena fighter, it's not exactly essential. But I ended up going back to the PSP version to get a bit more footage for this video, and whew, 30 is pretty rough, I ain't gonna lie. And while I don't necessarily think that the 60 FPS is going to make this game an undying masterpiece or anything, it is a damn sight better than what it used to be. I did notice there are one, maybe two areas like this particular menu transition that are still stuck at 30, but it's such a minor aspect it's barely worth mentioning. Considering how easy this game is to run, it is a bit of a shame that 120 or even higher frame rates weren't on the table, but in all fairness, I do get why. Even putting aside the fact that getting it to 60 would have been a pain, considering the main aspects such as animations, game speed, and physics are likely tied to the frame rate, the truth is allowing for more variable frame rate options would also likely throw a wrench in the plans for things like online and crossplay, as you and your opponents would likely need to be running the game at the same tick rate for it to work perfectly. Speaking of which, online, crossplay, rollback, and something that a lot of people are missing, offline, have all been added to the game. The original version of Ys vs Trails was capable of multiplayer via the PSP's ad hoc system, so if you and your friends all had copies of the game, you could connect to each other's PSPs and play over a short-ranged wireless connection. And you still can play like that for the Switch release of the game, but in today's day and age, there's much more convenient ways to play with your friends. Firstly, we now have online lobbies that you can use used to play across the internet, with basic options to limit your visibility and the use of passcodes so you don't have randoms joining you and your friends' matches. It's a pretty basic lobby system, but the important stuff is there. What really surprised me, however, was the announcement of rollback netcode being added to the game via GGPO. I won't bog you down with all of the details, but for online play to work, you need some sort of buffer to make sure that both you and your opponent are in sync with each other, and this usually takes the form of both games having some sort of a delay on all of your inputs. This gives you and your opponent a few extra milliseconds to receive the signals that the two of you are sending to each other, but unfortunately has the byproduct of giving you some heavy input delay, which makes everything feel like it's playing underwater. And the worse that your connection is, the bigger that input delay is going to be. Rollback technically does this too, but it's able to mitigate it by essentially predicting what inputs both players will do and then rolling it back if it gets it wrong, which means that the input delay can be removed, or at the very least heavily reduced, so it doesn't feel so sluggish to play. And the only cost is that very occasionally, if you have a terrible connection, you may see the game rewind by a second or two here and there. Needless to say, like many things in this port, it is a little bit overkill, since we're not exactly working with frame-perfect inputs of a more complex fighting here, but it is super cool to see, especially since while implementing rollback into a game is certainly a lot simpler than a lot of Japanese devs will have you believe, it's still not exactly a free lunch either, and it's insane that they've gone as far as they have for a little Kosoge fighting game like East vs Trails. The other really cool thing is that crossplay is available too, so whether you've got the game on PC, Switch or PlayStation, you'll be good to go and won't have to worry about getting matching versions with all of your friends. Why this is especially important is because, well, let's be honest here, East vs Trails is not exactly Street Fighter 6, is it? Hell, it's not even JoJo's All-Star Battle. This game needs every single boost to its online play count that it can get, cause yikes. I was able to get 2 matches with strangers on launch day, and honestly I should have tried to find a couple more, because my attempts to do the same not one day later didn't bore any fruit. Unfortunately, this game is realistically going to require you to arrange games via a Discord or something, and won't be able to be played online just on a whim. But if I'm perfectly honest, that was to be expected. Luckily, this is where the game being predominantly single player does end up helping it quite a bit. But honestly, I think this is where the new offline multiplayer options is where the port really shines. Since the game is no longer confined to a dedicated handheld, you can just play it with multiple people on a single system and it'll just work. Something I did find amusing is that since each player won't have their own separate screen, the camera will now zoom out accordingly to fit everybody on it instead of using that old radar system. And depending on what stage you end up picking, it can go pretty far. And the best part is that since it can be a 4-player fighter, you could genuinely have scenarios where you've got 2 separate 1v1s happening at either end of the map. So a situation like this is entirely possible. And a cool little bonus is that a lot of the geometry fixes and tweaks that were made to accommodate for the ultra-wide aspect ratios actually came in handy for making these wide view camera shots look a lot better. The last 2 things I want to mention about the new multiplayer suite is that the single device offline multiplayer can actually be mixed and matched with the online mode. So if you're in a situation where you've got a friend or 2 over but another in a Discord call, you can still all play together with just the 2 devices. And I really like this because it takes me back to the good old days of Halo 3 and Halo Reach. And speaking of which, if you are playing in person but want to go that extra mile to give everybody their own separate screen, then good old fashioned LAN parties are an option, and they even work with crossplay as well. You can daisy chain a PS4, a PS5, a PC, and a Switch all together via Ethernet and have them playing a multiplayer match together, which sounds baffling to me, but does make a lot of sense considering everything else. I think that between these new multiplayer features and the boost to 60 FPS, it's already making a huge justification for this port's existence as a worthwhile endeavor, as at the end of the day, it's just doing a much better job of preserving this part of Falcom's history with a version of the game that is not only more refined, but more accessible than ever. You're not only getting a much better, more stable product than if you just emulated it, but you're also getting ways that you can enjoy it as intended without the multiple hoops that you'd otherwise need to jump through to actually get there. But this, however, is not where the talking points end, because there's all of the other visual enhancements like the textures, the UI, and all of the stuff like the 2D assets that we can't just make look better by rendering at a higher resolution or activating various PC driver level features. Now, this technically could have been included in the earlier section about resolution and such, but as a guy who really likes squeezing the most out of a game visually, this stuff really appeals to me, and the amount of work that has gone into this area specifically demands it gets its own section. As you might expect, in order to get a PSP game looking somewhat presentable as a modern release, stuff like AI upscaling is kind of required. Well, that is unless you've got the money to burn manually recreating or at the very least tracing over all of the old textures. But I do want to preface that this isn't the relatively new gen AI that every artist, non-Philistine, and person who cares for the environment should hate, but is instead using older techniques that are not morally and ethically dubious by their very nature. These AI upscales is the same sort of stuff that's used in the PC ports for things like Yakuza 3 and 4 and Persona 4 Golden. Something also to note is that even the original PSP release technically had some sort of upscaling on all of its textures. This is technically something you can turn off in an emulator, but the PSP actually had an internal real-time texture upscaler that it could use on every single one of its games, making it a pretty cool optimization tool. This was a way to reduce the UMD's file sizes, but also an optimization trick to lessen the load on the PSP's RAM. A really neat trick from back in the day, but the thing is a real-time texture upscaler from 2005 is never going to be a more sophisticated one from more modern times. So while there is the argument that these upscalers do kind of smear and ruin the textures a little bit, they're still a damn sight better than what we were already using on the original release. The other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the bad press around these AI texture upscalers is caused by people who don't really know what they're doing, making really crappy texture packs. Luckily, Refint games do know what they're doing and understand the two fundamental rules of using this tech. The first being that you can't just plug everything in and expect the upscaler to just do its stuff. There's a lot of different settings that you can tweak and adjust, and sometimes one upscaler might be really good at something but really bad at something else that another upscaler happens to be okay with. While we don't know what specific upscalers Refint games used, we do know from their dev blog that they used multiple different ones depending on the content, which is already a really good start. The second rule to getting the most out of this tech is realizing that it's not a magic bullet. At the end of the day, those same old problem areas of the old upscalers making them look really smeary will start to rear their head if you use and abuse it. If you're trying to make 4K or godforsake 8K textures out of PSP or N64 assets or something, it's gonna look really bad. At the end of the day, the upscaler can only really work with what it is given, so if you feed it crap, that's what you're gonna get back in return. And if you try and go to the moon with that, then it's gonna look even worse. And this is the real secret as to why these textures and assets look as good as they do in this release. See, Refint games didn't just throw everything into the upscaler and call it a day. They were actually able to hunt down and get access to the best possible textures that they could use as a base. And this can come in three different forms. The first being that the baseline improvement to all textures was that they were able to get uncompressed versions of all of the assets from the original game. This means that things like compression artifacts weren't present, and they didn't need to do stuff like de-dithering before they could throw them in the upscaler. The second was that they were actually able to get access to some higher resolution assets that weren't ever in the game files. I imagine this probably applies to the character portraits for the game's story mode. Since while there are a couple of the telltale signs of upscaling being in play here, they're significantly nicer looking than the ones that you'd get in the HD texture pack for the PSP version. And in fact, I think they've done something really clever with the story mode assets. Because when first starting out, I wasn't actually sure if they were upscaled or not. And I think what's happening here is that they have at least one HD portrait for every single character, but they don't necessarily have a HD portrait for every single individual emotion. So instead instead of upscaling every individual variation, they've only applied it to each unique expression and blended those faceplates to the one actual HD portrait that they do have. Or at the very least, that's the impression I got about how they went about doing this. I imagine this method was also used to improve the look of all of the support characters in the game, because they look significantly better compared to the PSP release. The final types of textures that they used were ones that they got from other Falcom games. While East vs Trails was a PSP exclusive, a lot of its assets, like its stages, were actually taken from other games and tweaked around a bit to become a fighting game arena. And what this means is that the developers are able to go into these other games and pull the textures out of them to use in East vs Trails to get the absolute best quality, resulting in a scenario where we are relying on an upscaler far less. And as one final little thing talking about these 2D assets, they actually went back and retook new screenshots for all of the tutorial menus when a lesser port would have just upscaled those too. Now, the last thing that really surprised me, as it would take more than just hard work and effort from the publishers and developers, is that they actually got all of the English voice actors in to do a full voiceover for the game's story mode. Now, the game's story mode is not particularly long, there is 5 different routes, but each one of them are only about 2 hours. But that's for a fighting game with visual novel style cutscenes. It's still a fair bit. And it's not like this is a mainline title or anything. If any game could have gotten away with not having English voiceover, it would have been this one. Alas, it is here, and it's pretty good. The story isn't anything to really write home about, it is just fan service at the end of the day, but it's cute seeing more interactions with the characters that I know and love. And speaking of which, one thing that I did complain about in my original review is that the game isn't really all that relevant in this day and age. My argument was that by the time that the fan translation had come out, the zeitgeist around Falcom had moved on, and many of the characters in this game were not particularly relevant. The Trails in the Sky side of the roster was perfectly fine because a lot of these characters were still relevant in the newer games. But for the East side of the game, outside of Adol and Dogi and maybe Geis and Chester, the East side was all focused on East 7, which does make sense since it was the only party system East game out at the time, but my big complaint with it is that by this point, these characters don't really mean an awful lot to a lot of people. The sentiment was, is anybody really excited to play Elk of all people? And I think that something like adding new characters is ludicrous and way out of the question. At that point, you might as well just be making a new game. And this argument does still hold water. The situation with the East side of the roster is still exactly the same. But the difference now is that the Trails in the Sky side of the roster is actually very, very relevant. With the new remakes coming out, East vs Trails is re-releasing at the best possible time it probably ever could. I mean, preferably it probably should have came out after the SC or Sky 3rd remakes, but for the most part, it's probably releasing at the perfect time it ever could. I think all it takes is a look at the game's gallery mode to be able to perfectly demonstrate what this game and what this remaster both are. East vs Trails is a celebratory time capsule of Falcom over the years. Sure, it does focus on East and Trails, but you don't need to look far to find things from all over Falcom's history. There's tons of great artwork in here, as well as music and remixes from various games that all sound excellent. And if East vs Trails Alternative Saga is a time capsule of Falcom's history, then Refint Games Remaster is a time capsule of East vs Trails itself. It's a port that goes above and beyond, polishing the game to the best it could possibly be, even if it's probably to the publisher's detriment. Either way, Refint Games were able to do so much with so little, and if that's not Falcom as hell, I don't know what is. Hey everyone, how's it going? Hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, all that jazz, and press the hype button if you're able to see it. It's a new thing that only some people are seeing, but apparently it really helps out smaller channels like me. I'd like to give a big thanks to Refint Games for providing a review code for me, as well as a very special thanks to my single Patreon, Ray Channer. And yeah, that's right, I have a Patreon now. I still need to put out some sort of a video properly announcing it. But if that interests you in some shape or form, I'd really appreciate it if you give it a look. I'm switching to a new job soon, but I've actually got quite a few different projects that are all very close to completion. So that's something to keep an eye out for. Until then, however, I'll be seeing you.